Right now, if you get lost, truly lost, somewhere unfamiliar, the first thing you do is reach for your phone. You open a map. A blue dot appears. The world orients itself around you, and within seconds you know exactly where you are on the surface of the earth, to within a few meters. Now imagine that blue dot disappearing. The app gone. The phone gone. No roads, no signs, no landmarks you recognize. Just ocean in every direction, a canoe beneath you, and the task of finding an island the size of a small town somewhere in 25 million square miles of open water. That was not a hypothetical for your ancestors. That was Tuesday. And here is the thing that no one fully prepares you for when you learn about ancient navigation. They weren't stumbling. They weren't guessing. They weren't sailing vaguely in the direction of hope and occasionally getting lucky. They were executing a system of knowledge so sophisticated, so precise, and so completely different from anything the modern world considers intelligent, that when European explorers first encountered Polynesian voyagers in the Pacific, they genuinely could not explain how it was being done. The instruments didn't exist. The charts didn't exist. The technology, by every definition they understood, was absent. And yet people were crossing the largest ocean on the planet with accuracy that rivaled European navigation using compasses and sextants. The story of how they did it is one of the most remarkable in human history. And it begins not with tools, but with the body. Somewhere in the Marshall Islands, roughly 2,000 years ago, navigators were making maps, not on paper, not carved into stone, made from sticks, bound together with fiber, with small shells fixed at the intersections. These objects, called rebelib and matang, look to a modern eye like abstract art. A grid of bent and crossed sticks, seemingly decorative, completely illegible. But they were not decorative. They were some of the most functionally precise navigational instruments ever produced by human hands. They were maps of waves. Every island in an open ocean creates a disturbance in the swell patterns that radiate outward from it, sometimes for hundreds of miles. The island pushes back against the sea. The swells refract, bend, pile up, split apart. And if you know exactly what patterns to look for, those distortions in the water tell you where land is before you can see it, smell it, or hear it. The stick charts encoded these patterns. Different configurations of sticks represented different islands and the specific way each one bent the surrounding swells. Navigators did not read these charts at sea. They memorized them on land, and then at sea they lay down in the bottom of the canoe, pressed their bodies against the hull, and felt the water moving beneath them with their skin. The ocean, to them, was not empty. It was a text. And they had learned to read it with their bodies. This is the first thing to understand about ancient navigation. The instruments they used were not external to them. They were internal. The most important navigational tool in the Pacific for thousands of years was the human nervous system, trained over years of apprenticeship to perceive things that an untrained person sitting in the same canoe would feel as nothing more than ordinary rocking. Now move from the Marshall Islands north and east into the broader Pacific world of Polynesian navigation, and the sophistication deepens further. Polynesian voyagers settled virtually every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Easter Island in the east, in canoes over centuries, crossing distances that still seem improbable even with modern vessels. To do this, they built something that has no physical form and cannot be excavated by archaeologists. They built a star compass inside the mind. Polynesian star compass is a mental map of the horizon divided into 32 points, each one corresponding to the rising or setting position of a specific star or constellation. Not a map you hold in your hand, a map you hold in your mind, complete, precise, and oriented to the entire sky. A trained navigator knew which star rose at which point on the horizon, how it moved across the sky through the night, when it would set, and what the next star in sequence would be. A continuous, rotating celestial reference system that worked in any direction and in any season because the navigator had internalized its logic, not just memorized a fixed set of rules. A man named Maupialuk, a Micronesian navigator who became, by the late 20th century, one of the last living masters of traditional Pacific wayfinding, described the fundamental concept of this navigation in a way that stops most Western minds completely. The canoe doesn't move, he said. The islands move. This is not poetry. This is a functional navigational framework called ETAC, and it is, in a precise technical sense, as valid as any other reference system. Modern physics is perfectly comfortable with the idea that you can choose any point as stationary and describe all other motion relative to it. Mao chose the canoe. The stars wheeled overhead. The island slid toward him across the surface of the ocean. And by tracking the movement of islands he had already passed relative to the stars above them, he knew exactly where he was in relation to where he was going. Without a single instrument, without a single written notation, navigating at night across open ocean with accuracy that stunned every Western researcher who ever sailed with him. But the Pacific is not the only place where this kind of knowledge was built. In Australia, for perhaps 60,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples navigated a continent larger than Europe using a system that is, in some ways, even more astonishing than the star compass. They mapped the land in song. Song lines, called dreaming tracks, are routes across the Australian landscape encoded in music. A specific song, sung in sequence, describes a journey, the features of the terrain, the water sources, the sacred sites, the distances between them. The song is the map. To know the song is to be able to travel the route. And because the songs were maintained and transmitted through ceremony across generations, the map was never lost, never damaged by water, never stolen by an enemy. Because it existed inside every person who had learned it. The entire continent was mapped this way, interlocked networks of song lines covering thousands of miles, shared across language groups so that a person could travel from the coast to the desert interior by following the singing of people who had never met each other, whose languages were mutually unintelligible, but who had inherited the same encoded geography. The European settlers who arrived in Australia in the 18th century looked at this continent and saw an unmapped wilderness. The people living there looked at the same land and saw something written on every hill, every waterhole, every stretch of red earth. The map was not absent, it was simply stored in a medium that Europeans did not have the categories to recognize. Across the other side of the world, in the Arctic, the Inuit were solving the same problem in a landscape that seems, to the uninitiated, like the most featureless environment on Earth. Flat, white, identical in every direction, no trees, no landmarks, no distinguishing features of any kind. Except that it is not featureless, not to someone who has been taught to read it. Wind in the Arctic blows predominantly from consistent directions. And as it blows across the snow, it sculpts it, creating formations called sastrugi, irregular ridges and furrows whose shape encodes the history of the wind that made them. An experienced Inuit navigator could read these formations the way you might read a compass, determining the prevailing wind direction and therefore orienting themselves in space. They also memorized the locations and shapes of specific pressure ridges in the sea ice, the patterns of snow accumulation on the leeward sides of rocks, the behavior of particular animals in specific weather conditions. The entire Arctic landscape was a navigational document, written in ice and wind, available to anyone who had been trained to read it. What is striking, across all of these systems, the wave charts, the star compass, the song lines, the sastrugi, is not just their sophistication, it is what they have in common. None of them depend on an external object that can be lost, broken, or left behind. All of them depend on knowledge stored inside a human being, developed through sustained attention to the world over years of learning, and transmitted through relationship rather than through writing. This is not a coincidence. It is a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge than the one the modern world operates on. Today, we externalize knowledge constantly, into phones, into GPS systems, into maps, into written instructions. The advantage is obvious: the knowledge is stable, reproducible, shareable. The disadvantage is less discussed, but equally real. We have become dependent on the medium. Take away the phone and most people in a modern city cannot navigate home across 5 miles of unfamiliar terrain. The knowledge has not been internalized. It lives in the device, and when the device fails, so does the navigation. Your ancestors could not afford that failure mode. The ocean does not provide a second chance. The desert does not wait while you troubleshoot. The knowledge had to live in the body, in the mind, in the carefully maintained relationship between a trained human nervous system and a world that was, if you knew how to read it, constantly telling you exactly where you were. Here is what this means for how you understand human intelligence. For most of recorded history, the dominant Western narrative has been one of progress, from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, from lost to found. The story of navigation, in this telling, goes from wandering tribespeople to Columbus with his compass to GPS satellites beaming signals from orbit, each stage more advanced than the last. But that story has a problem. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific did not have GPS, they didn't have compasses, and yet they accomplished something that GPS-equipped modern sailors specifically attempt to replicate as a challenge, because it is genuinely that difficult. They weren't less sophisticated than the Europeans who arrived centuries later in ships with iron instruments and written charts. In many measurable ways, they were more sophisticated, because the knowledge they carried was integrated into themselves in a way that no instrument dependency can replicate. The capacity was not absent in earlier humans. It was present and trained in ways that modern people have largely allowed to atrophy, because the devices we have built have made the training seem unnecessary. Your body still carries that capacity. The part of the human brain responsible for spatial navigation, the hippocampus, is the same structure that Mau Pialug used to hold the star compass, the same structure that Inuit navigators used to memorize the sastrugi patterns, the same structure that Aboriginal Australians used to hold the song lines. Research on London taxi drivers, who must memorize the entire layout of a vast and irregular city, shows that this region of the brain physically grows larger in response to sustained navigational practice. The capacity is plastic. It responds to training. It has simply not been trained in most modern people because the phone made the training feel redundant. But here is the thing your ancestors understood, and that the existence of all these systems proves. The world is not silent. It is not featureless. It is not blank until a map is printed on top of it. The world is constantly speaking, in wave patterns, in star positions, in wind direction, in the shapes of clouds above unseen islands, in the way snow drifts against an immovable rock. The question is never whether the information is there. The question is always whether anyone has been trained to hear it. Every human being who has ever lived on this planet before the last 2 or 3 centuries navigated by learning to hear what the world was already saying, not by imposing a grid onto the landscape, but by learning the language the landscape was already speaking. That language has not gone silent. It is still being spoken. It is only that most of us have stopped listening.